First, let me introduce myself. I'm the Reverend John Parke, now living in a retirement community, Reed's Landing, over in Springfield, Massachusetts. I have been asked to turn back my memory time clock 60 years to report some of my experiences as a U.S. Army chaplain in World War II. Actually, I was born way back in 1916, 87 years ago. The year my father and mother purchased the Emily Dickinson House in Amherst to be the rectory of Grace Episcopal Church, where my father was the minister. Our boy's bedroom 50 years earlier had been Emily's bedroom, where she had the small desk at which she wrote the many hundreds of her well-known poems. As a child, very little did I realize that someday hundreds of her now well-known poems would be remembered, and visitors would pass through our room to see where the famous poetess had poured out her heart in verse. Well, God blessed me in that home. And God blessed me, too, with a train of wonderful ancestors. My mother was a direct descendant of Robert Cushman, who was an organizer of the Plymouth colony and whose members had crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower. On my father's side, my great-great-grandfather had served as a sergeant in the Revolutionary War. I still have his prayer book. My great-grandfather was the first doctor to practice medicine in the territory which later became the state of Michigan. And my grandfather, Hervey Parke, was a founder of the Parke Davis Pharmaceutical Company in Detroit. In no way did I earn or deserve this background, but I am grateful for the incentive my ancestors and my parents set for the five of us children to do something worthwhile in the world. My choice was to follow my own father's call to ministry in the church. After graduation from Princeton in 1938, I went on to seminary in New York City for 3 more years of theological study. While I was there, our nation suffered the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, and the armies of Adolf Hitler were inflicting terror in Europe. And we in America were now deeply involved in World War II. Bombs from Germany were almost daily being rained upon London. Hundreds of children were being shipped to safety here in America. On one of the very last of these shipments, there also came a lovely Irish girl, Joan Lee Cole, a recent graduate from Trinity College in Dublin. She had received a scholarship for travel and study in America, awarded by the English-speaking Union. At a dinner party in New York, I had the good fortune not only to meet her, but soon to fall in love with her. And after my seminary graduation and ordination to the ministry, Joan Lee Cole and I were married. For 2 years, I served a parish in Greenfield and Turners Falls, Massachusetts, and by the summer of 1944, my wife had given birth to 2 little boys, Richard and David. For us, life was beautiful, but not for the world. The Army was in desperate need for chaplains, and I felt it laid upon my heart to volunteer. My induction was in September of 1944, and I was directed to chaplain school at Fort Devens. There, along with other clergy from many denominations, I received my first taste of military life, wearing a uniform, marching, saluting, and learning basic lessons for my coming experience as a chaplain. Completing this work, I was commissioned a chaplain, first lieutenant, and was sent by train to Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, to serve in the 261st Regiment of the 65th Infantry Division, and to minister to those in basic training. Along with every GI, I too experienced the infiltration course, crawling 100 yards on my tummy with bullets whistling over my head, and sleeping in a pup tent in total blackout darkness. Our regiment had 3 chaplains, one Roman Catholic, Chaplain Bowles, and 2 Protestant, Chaplain Myers and myself. It was now late in the year of 1944, and soon we were planning Christmas services and putting up decorations in the chapel. And we were counseling the fears of many young men away from home for the first time in their lives. And finally, in early January 1945, it was time for our departure. Our commander was Major General Stanley Reinhardt. Perhaps because my aunt was a close and dear friend of his wife, Mrs. Reinhardt, in Birmingham, Michigan, I was given the honor of conducting the final service at Camp Shelby, asking God's protection for our 65th Division and giving God's blessing upon some 3,000 men. The next morning, we were loaded onto trains, heading north to Camp Shanks near New York City, the departure center for troops boarding ships for Europe. Very soon, we were well on our way. Our convoy was accompanied by a destroyer, protecting us from possible submarine attack. But everyone sensed there was danger ahead. All chaplains, once again, were busy calming the fears of the men, perhaps 10 years our junior. And down in the hold, we held our daily services, always crowded, before bedtime. We would sing that old hymn, Eternal Father, strong to save. Some days later, thankfully, we all did arrive safely in the port of Le Havre in northern France. There we were piled into trucks and jeeps, heading for nearby Camp Lucky Strike. Arriving in the darkness of night, it was miserably cold as we set up our tents. France had experienced an early snow in January. Now there was a thaw. The following morning we awoke to the sound of trucks outside, churning the roads into deep mud. Walking across the road, I would sink with mud covering my new combat boots. It was not surprising that after 2 or 3 weeks of this, many of our men were suffering heavy colds and flu, myself included. I was running a fever of 103. First, I was cared for in a field tent, but when my fever rose to 106 degrees, and they rushed me by ambulance to a field hospital in Dieppe, and there I was diagnosed by the doctor with something called atypical pneumonia. 20 sulfa pills were placed in my hands. I was to take them immediately. And I was isolated in a private room. That evening, I was delirious. But I kept repeating a simple prayer, Jesus be with me, Jesus be with me. Had I yielded to fear that night, quite honestly, I think I might have died. But I was determined not to die. I must get home to my precious wife and 2 small sons. And then in the darkness, I felt a strange light hovering over me. There was an ice-cold shock, followed by a flood of warmth pouring into every cell of my body. Oh, I could feel it. I knew I was under God's protection. And sure enough, the next morning, my temperature had dropped to 99 and then to normal. One day soon after, my stock flew high among the patients and the hospital nurses when none other than General Reinhardt himself appeared at our door to pay me a visit. Well, my full recovery took about 2 or 3 weeks. And by the time I was discharged, our whole outfit had moved on across the Rhine. Fortunately, I was able to catch up, though in the muddle and confusion, all of my chaplain's equipment had been misplaced and lost. And now, amid a convoy of trucks and jeeps, we were racing up the German Autobahn to Cologne. After the Battle of the Bulge, the tide of the war had turned at last. On all sides, the Nazi troops were beginning to surrender. But occasionally, we were still being strafed with bullets from German Messerschmitts. At these moments, our columns would stop, and we would all dive for shelter in the woods. Once I recall lying down beside someone else under a bush. But when the all clear sounded, I noticed that he did not move. It was a shock to discover that he was a dead German soldier. As our 65th Division now turned southward toward Regensburg and Austria, there were still occasional shots from snipers in the woods. Our machine guns sprayed the woods, and I saw a sniper fall to the ground from his perch. Yet another sniper came running toward us with his arms raised in surrender. Before I, as a chaplain, could intervene, he was surrounded by our soldiers, and someone shot him to death. It hurt me to see this, but their anger was understandable, for some of our men, too, had been killed. One of my good friends, Lieutenant Klein, was among them. Back at our Christmas party at Camp Shelby, I had once danced with his wife. Now it was hard for me to send a letter of condolence to her and to her family. Anger at our enemies may well seem justified as a tragedy of war, but anger and retribution is never God's way. Jesus impressed upon us all that we are to love and forgive, yes, even our enemies, to return good for evil. In services of worship, I always taught this message. At last, our journey into Austria was finished as we met the Russian army at a bridge over the Enns River. Here, our General Reinhardt shook hands with the Russian general, and soon we read bold headlines in the Stars and Stripes: "Yanks meet Reds." I have it here beside me. The end of battle, however, simply marked the beginning of the next phase, the occupation. There was cleanup to be done. Some of us in jeeps followed a Sherman tank when it crashed open the gate to the Mauthausen concentration camp a few miles north of Enns. German SS guards had already fled. But as we entered, we found many starving Jewish prisoners rejoicing to be released. Many were so thin that they looked like walking skeletons. There was still a pile of dead bodies which had not yet been cremated. We saw a spot where many men had been shot to death. There were bullet holes on the wall behind where they had stood. We also passed through the gas chamber with its nozzles jutting out from the ceiling. Naked men and women had been marched in expecting a water shower, but were sprayed with gas. And of course, many hundreds had died there. I was glad that we had arrived in time to save at least a few. During the occupation, our regiment was soon split up. Squads of soldiers were scattered to patrol many small villages in the beautiful Lake District of Austria. In Ebensee, there were some billeted in a beautiful lakeside villa that once had belonged to the musician Franz Lehár, composer of the Merry Widow Waltz. Some of you may remember that. Another group in the mountain town of Alt-Assi was guarding a salt mines where in caverns Nazi leaders had stored a hoard of art treasures that had been stolen from Jewish homes in Germany, in France, and Belgium. Everywhere it seemed that Austrians were rejoicing to be freed from the Nazi domination, and we were warmly welcomed. My work as a chaplain required jeep trips to hold services once a week in 11 different places. Sometimes it was in a bar room or a movie theater, or sometimes just outside, with the back seat of my Jeep folded down to become an altar with a cross and 2 candlesticks. I played a pump organ while my driver assistant led the singing. My homilies were usually brief and to the point. I had been forewarned not to read from a manuscript as I'm doing now, but maybe to use just a few notes. The soldiers' attention was held only as we looked them in the eye and spoke to them from our heart. Fear was no longer the problem. Now it was loneliness. Loneliness for folks at home. Naturally, there were sexual temptations, which often led to venereal disease. Rubber condoms were available from the supply room, but we gave frequent reminders that God was counting on us to be faithful to the trust of our loved ones at home. I had many good officers to help me in this area of need, but at times there were disappointments. Once I had arranged with a captain to prepare a room with chairs for a Sunday service and to pass the word to his company, the place and the hour. But I arrived to find an empty room with no one present. So I knocked at the captain's door. A young Fräulein in a nightdress answered the door and whispered, "Bitte, please?" I asked, "May I see the captain?" She replied, "He was schlafen, asleep." There were these times of frustration. But I was grateful for many fine officers who did set a high example for their men. Often villagers who understood English attended our services, and we welcomed them as we shared the gospel message of faith and love and hope for the future. Hundreds of DPs, that is, displaced persons, had fled westward to Austria from Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, not just from the Nazis, but also from the Russians, who terrified them. As a chaplain, many applied to me for help. I recall one disheveled lady who had played piano concerts in Hungary, but where she had lost all of her family and lost her lovely home with its two gorgeous Steinway concert pianos. She had walked west for 200 miles with just a suitcase and sleeping in barns and fields. And now when she was washed up and rested, I was happy that I could find for her a place to live and also a job as an interpreter at our headquarters in Linz. All of the DPs were desperate for food. Near our mess hall, they were eager to receive into little cans that they carried any scraps of leftover food from our mess kits. As a child, I had been trained to join the Clean Plate Club, never taking more than I could eat. But now I piled high the food in my mess kit so that I might leave a nourishing meal, perhaps for some hungry family. Even many Austrian families were in need, hard up to buy clothes for their children. In shops, authorized tickets were required for making a purchase. Mothers needing shoes for a child would come asking my help to secure some of the precious tickets. Healthy exercise and recreation were important for our men, and I found a bond with many as I shared in their games. The Special Service Department had provided bats and balls and gloves for softball games, and more balls for soccer and touch football. For tennis, there were also rackets and balls, but no shoes, and we ran around in our socks. And others, of course, enjoyed many card games and paperback books that had been received from home. At one time, I was the only chaplain in the steel manufacturing town of Steyr in eastern Austria. In our desire to build a bridge of friendship with the people, I was asked to plan a party for all the children. It was December of 1945, when early in the month they always celebrated the feast of St. Nicholas. The Burgermeister, that is, the mayor, arranged for us to use the school gymnasium. Our soldiers secured a tall pine tree, which was set up and decorated. For entertainment, I had driven to headquarters in Linz, where I was fortunate to find a big jolly clown who rode a unicycle, and also his cute teenage daughter, who was a ballet dancer. In Steyr, at the party, the clown had the children roaring with laughter at his jokes and his antics on the unicycle. And of course, the cute dancing daughter brought whistles of approval from our soldiers. And then we all gathered around the tree, and we joined in singing O Tannenbaum, that is, O Christmas Tree, one of their familiar songs. and also Stille Nacht, that is, Silent Night. Our army had captured a German special services boat on the Danube, which was loaded with some 40 Hohner keyboard accordions. I had claimed one of these, so I was able at this party to add music to the singing. And then I closed with a prayer for peace in the world, and I gave them all a closing blessing from God. The Red Cross had a donut making machine which had run off 1,000 donuts. As the children left, each one received 2 donuts, a Milky Way, and a Mars bar to take home. So it was a happy, happy day for the community, and it built a good relationship with our troops. Eventually, I had fulfilled the necessary 57 points that were required for me to return home. So on the way, I passed through Berchtesgaden, where I saw the remains of Hitler's mountain home, which had been smashed by our bombers. As a souvenir, I picked up a small rock, which I hold here in my hand. And this was from his marble fireplace. Just something to remember. I also picked up a bit of porcelain tile from his bathroom. I wanted to take that home too. It happened that our ETO commander, Dwight Eisenhower, was also a visitor that day at Berchtesgaden. He expressed a desire to see Hitler's eyrie, which was way, way up at the mountaintop. There was a steep, rocky path on which ordinary soldiers could hike up. But there was also a small incline railway car where at the entrance was a sign for officers only. Ike was asked, "Sir, would you like to hike up on the path, or would you like to ride up in the car?" Eisenhower grinned, and he replied, "I think I'll walk up." On another occasion, during the occupation, some officers were allowed to send for their wives to join them there in Europe. Once again, someone asked, "Sir, how about Mamie? Will she be coming over to join you?" Eisenhower replied, "No. If all the soldiers' wives cannot come, I see no reason why I should make myself an exception." So our GIs really appreciated Eisenhower's humility. Before leaving Austria, I also stopped for a weekend in Salzburg, and there I was invited to lead a Sunday morning service in the Mozarteum concert hall. It was quite an exciting experience to worship in that beautiful, world-famous building, and to hear a chorus of 1,000 male voices, all singing praise to God. Finally, I was across France, and I was boarding a Liberty ship to return home. This time, it was with a happy group of returning soldiers. Once again, I had the chance to use the accordion. Every evening up on deck and under the stars, we sang Home on the Range and many other familiar camp songs. It was good to be on our way. After landing in New Jersey, I was shipped back to my starting place at Camp Devens, Fort Devens. And there I was discharged, and there I was greeted by my dear wife, and not just by 2, but by 3 small boys. When I had first left home, we had not realized that my Joan was pregnant. And now, upon my return, I was introduced to our third little boy, Robert. And soon we were all home again in Greenfield in May of 1946. Now nearly 60 years have passed. Robert is no longer an infant. Now Robert towers above me at 6 feet 6 inches. For the past 27 years, Robert has served as a doctor in the U.S. Air Force in Turkey, in England, Hawaii, and elsewhere. And next week, he will be retiring as a colonel. And my wife and I will be flying to Wright-Patterson Airfield out in Ohio to attend his retirement ceremony. We're proud of him. We're proud of all our children. We are all trying to play our part well to curtail the evils that still afflict our troubled world and to preserve the liberties that we all treasure and long to pass on to the next generation. And God bless us all.